It is so exciting to be here and feel that energy in the other room and in this room too. It's really a huge honor for me to be here after trying to be here several years in a row. It's great to be here finally once and for all. So thanks very much for having me. You know, as was just said, you know, like the high water women, my professional roots also hail from Wall Street and from microfinance kind of at the same time. In fact, when I was in the JP Morgan training program in the early 80s here in New York, I was so worried about becoming a banker and losing kind of my soul or never having a soul or something, that I started a Meals on Wheels-like program in Harlem. And the first thing I had to do was go and get a loan to buy a vehicle to move the food around. And I went to Women's World Banking because it sounded like my kind of place. And that was my first exposure to microfinance. Of course, I walked away from that meeting with no loan, but having made the commitment to produce their first ever loan officer manual with my newly minted JP Morgan credit officer skills. So my whole career since then has been sort of intertwined between social issues and finance, social purpose and finance. It also, frankly, was the first of many times that I didn't get what I wanted, but I got something a whole lot better in the long run. So anyway, that's one of the reasons why it's so nice to be here with all of you today. So yes, like all of you, I believe in markets. I believe in social justice. I believe that there are not only no necessary trade-offs between financial return and social return, but there are clear and definite synergies between social and financial return over the long haul. And of course, I believe in the wisdom and power of women. And by that, I mean the women I've learned most from in my life have been, you know, market women in Rwanda, women in Indonesia, and smallholder farmers, all the way up to women that have been bankers and secretaries of state. So it's an exciting time. I'm not allowed to say stuff like that, but I just couldn't resist. So it's a super exciting time for me to be in this conversation about impact investing with all of you, because I really do believe that we're at an inflection point, a clear moment today, right now, that's a tipping point in this sector. You know, we went through the early sort of teething phases of impact investing, just like microfinance, where it started as a focused sort of club of leaders and visionaries, and a lot of concern about who gets to be in the club and who's out of the club and what the perimeters are. And of course, that period, just like in microfinance, in the early days, we were excluding the banks with big branch networks because they didn't look like us. Similar, that was the early phases of impact investing. And of course, that sort of clubby early phase is then followed by the inevitable period of hue and cry, of heat and light and noise, of rapture and backlash, you know, with some on one side saying, oh my God, it's $1 trillion industry, and others on the other side saying, no, it's a mere drop in the bucket and will never amount to much. As I've often described those two groups as being the breathless maximizers on the one hand, the $1 trillion people, and the derisive minimizers on the other hand. It doesn't matter at all in the end of the day. Of course, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter the size of impact investing compared to the financial markets as a whole. It matters about impact investing size relative to the paltry aid budgets of the total, right now globally, only $135 billion. So that's the number that we're trying to beat, not make. Anyway, I can go off on that. But anyway, there was a lot of discussion around, you know, the mainstream capital has finally arrived, and then others at the other end of the spectrum saying, these people are calling it impact investing, but it's just greenwashing. It's old wine in new bottles. It doesn't matter. So anyway, I feel like today we're finally arriving at a point when the sector is maturing clearly and has roots really that are strong enough to enable us to think about the diverse ways that different organizations with different incentives and tools and instruments can contribute to the sector. So we're allowing now, finally, this broad spectrum of approaches, and there's a growing appreciation that's necessary. There's a growing appreciation that we need, in fact, at either ends of the spectrum, both maximizing the impact per dollar, think, you know, small-scale irrigation, the grassroots business fund, root capital, et cetera, and at the other end of the spectrum, both maximizing the amount of dollars brought into impact investing. So maximizing the impact per dollar and maximizing the dollars for impact. And that, of course, is where many of the Wall Street and fund managers in the room fit in. I'd love to remember Fazli Abed, the founder of BRAC, biggest NGO, one of the most inspiring people on the planet, I think, who often has said, small is beautiful, but big is necessary. And I think that's where we are now, and in fact, investing is recognizing that we need both of these approaches. So as I say, I see us at this fulcrum or this tipping point because of a couple of things that are happening now, and I'm sure we'll hear about more during the course of the day. As I said, there's a greater acceptance of this need for diversity of preference and approach across the spectrum, first. Second, we're seeing a couple of examples of where organizations are really, truly reaching scale. You know, Leapfrog was able to raise $1 billion, not $100 million, although they did get $100 million from OPIC, but $1 billion in impact investing, that's a moment to celebrate. We've also seen elements of the ecosystem and the kind of the plumbing finally coming together in impact investing. One evidence of that is that some of the largest and most powerful foundations in the world are finally realizing that it's not bad to put grant money into something that somebody else may make money from later on, but that their money can be incredibly powerful catalysts to crowd in other people's money. So foundations are finally realizing that they have a really crucial role at getting things started. And we also now, a third reason I feel we're at this tipping point, is that we really have clear evidence now, valid, substantiated evidence, thanks to organizations like the GIN and like Cambridge Associates and others, that competitive returns can and are being achieved even amongst the social first funds. And then lastly, we're seeing governments all over the world, the G8, but also the US especially, really recognizing the power of impact investing and socially responsible investing to solve market failures that governments haven't been able to solve on their own. So I was asked to focus just for a couple of minutes here on the role of governments in stimulating socially responsible investment and impact investing. So I'd like to offer up just a few thoughts right here. So why is it so hard for governments and policymakers to engage in supporting SRI and impact investing? Well, frankly, mainly I feel it's because the regulatory systems and legal systems and all the other systems that were built to underpin philanthropy are completely different than the systems that were built to underpin investments. And there was no vision ever about the fact you could do something that combined the two and was right in the middle. So, you know, these systems were either about giving money away or making money, but there was no way to think about doing both at the same time. So government actions to fix this market failure, several have posed a number of different ways to think about it. The one I am drawn to is a framework that has basically three buckets that governments tend to fall into, ranging from the less activist way of supporting socially responsible investment and impact investing, all the way to very activist or in actual investments. So first, going from least to most active, you have the government actions around informing the markets, addressing information asymmetries, because investors tend to overestimate risks. This is things like, you know, labels like the Forest Stewardship Council labels on sustainably harvested wood, or Energy Star labels, or, you know, SEC disclosures on climate risk. So that's about informing people about risks, about these sectors. Second is stimulating. And stimulating can take the form of either creating incentives to spur action, you know, think of carbon markets or the creation of B Corp, or it can be removing restrictions that hinder these investments. Think the changes that were made to ERISA, for example. And then thirdly, governments can take the most activist role, and that is things like social impact bonds or creating development finance institutions like OPIC. That's where governments are, or making tax credits for certain activities. So that's the most activist range of things. And this brings me, of course, to OPIC. So OPIC, of course, is the U.S. government's development finance institution, and our mandate, our very mandate, at the core of our essence, the reason we go to work every day, is to find ways to catalyze private capital to flow into things and into markets and into frontier places that it wouldn't normally flow into in the service of sustainable economic development. We're basically a $20 billion huge, old impact investing fund, old but dynamic and changing all the time. And like the IFC or the other development finance institutions in other countries, each G8 country has one, all of our $20 billion is invested in socially responsible or ESG compliant investments. All of it has the intent to generate social value. All of it works with the private sector only. And all of it is, at the end of the day, profitable. So that's why, if you think about it, we're just a big social impact fund. And yes, we've been investing profitably this way for nearly 50 years. So what kind of investments do I mean? I mean everything from small-scale clean drinking water distribution networks in Ghana to huge desalination plant in Algeria that's providing a quarter of the clean water to that city. From solar home systems that we're financing the installation of in northern Nigeria, all the way through to the largest wind farm in Indonesia. From, helping create a garment factory, believe it or not, in Afghanistan, that it's employing war widows, all the way through to cement block manufacturing in Haiti following the earthquake there. So those are the kind of things that we're investing in that involve the private sector, that are profitable, and that have social value. And as we've tried over the last 7 years, 6.5 years that I've been at OPIC to really think about how can we use our unique sets of tools and appetites and skill set to address gaps in the impact investing market, we've tried really hard to make those adaptations and apply ourselves. And frankly, some of them have worked pretty well, and others have not worked at all, as we try to help fill out the ecosystem. And when I look at the challenges that we face as we've tried to adapt ourselves to fill in these gaps in the market, there are really significant challenges to building out this market, but I feel like the pieces are coming into place. Those challenges, I'll just mention them rather than go into them all, but there are things like exits, liquidity. How do you create exits for this market? Frankly, it's a problem for emerging markets as a whole, and the liquidity investors need to see. What about ticket size? Obviously we have huge institutions in the room, and they can't. Many of you can't write ticket sizes of $1, $5, or even $10 million. The cost of origination is too high. What about this whole plumbing or ecosystem that we all talk about? How do we make sure we get the right capital at the right place at the right time in the right sequence to support companies in this space? I mean, just like in the real world or the other world, you have angel capital giving way to venture capital and private equity and then commercial finance. We haven't built that ecosystem for this sector. And then the one that I feel is the most important of all, frankly, not only in our financial life, but our political life and elsewhere, is that our entire society lacks the incentives for long-term thinking. The solutions to the problems facing our planet and its people are all long-term solutions, and our entire society is geared around short-term thinking. And that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges. Lord knows I don't know how we're going to solve that one, but I have a few ideas we can talk about later. So all of these, all of these challenges, I'll just say in closing, all of these challenges can only be addressed through long-term, empathetic, generous partnerships. Partnerships between the rich and the poor, between government and the private sector, between long-term thinkers and short-term thinkers, between, banks and communities, donors and governments and investors. Partnership is what it's going to be all about, and I think that those partnerships have to be ego-free, label-free, agenda-free, so that we're really focusing on our common goal. So in sum and in closing, and as I look forward to sitting down with Lori and having discussion with all of you, I would say, it's happening. Anybody that complains or says that this progress in impact investing has been slow or uneven just doesn't get it. They don't get the magnitude or the enormity of what we're talking about. You all understand it. You understand that we're actually talking about changing the entire way the world thinks about money and capital and markets. That is enormous, and I think the progress that we've been making has been extraordinary. We're beginning to move the needle. It's become inevitable. This whole impact investing movement is become inevitable. It's big, it's revolutionary, it's happening. It has, as I like to say, the wind at its back and justice on its side. So thank you.
There we go.
Teamwork, partnership.
Exactly. Great. Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much. A great way to kick off the day. And I wanted to ask a couple of questions and then open it up to the audience. So if you have questions, I encourage you to be thinking about them. There are mics on either side of the auditorium, so please come down. And we've got plenty of questions ourselves, but we'll restrict just for a few before we invite the audience. So the one I wanted to kick off with is drilling down a little bit more deeply on the role of DFIs, the model and the relevance of the model. Increasingly, Anna mentioned in her opening the SDGs. A lot of people are talking about, in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, the need to mobilize mass amounts of private capital. 4 trillion per year is the conservative estimate. Yeah. How are we going to do that? It's got to be private capital, but when we look at how that will play out, a lot of people are suggesting that DFIs are uniquely positioned to bring in that private capital. Comment on the state of play of the DFI model and why you think it is particularly relevant in addressing the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thanks, Laurie. It's nice to be here with you. My old friend, Laurie, and I first met in the Czech Republic.
Don't date us.
I can't date us. We were putting Yankee bonds together just after the Berlin Wall came down. Anyway, we've known each other since the beginning of time. So on the DFI, frankly, I don't think I knew what a DFI was back then. Anyway. It was funny because when at the Monterey, which was sort of the precursor to Addis, the private sector was barely mentioned. Yep. Whereas at the Addis-Ababa agreement on the SDGs, it was clear that the private sector was completely essential to us being able to solve the world's challenges. But frankly, a lot of the people there didn't really know what that looked like. And I think it's entirely right because since OPIC was carved out of AID some 40 odd, almost 50 years ago. People know that the flows from the U.S. to emerging markets used to be, the vast majority of it was ODA aid, and a little tiny dribble was foreign direct investment, and of course that's completely reversed in the ensuing 40 odd years, and now for every dollar in aid abroad we're investing, there's $8 or $9 worth of foreign direct investment, and what's happening is that what's driving that is that businesses are actually willing and able to invest profitably with commercial models that work in things that they were never investing before, things that were once the exclusive domain of government budgets. Think the power sector. Power plants used to be built by governments, and now most of the power being installed now is not in the markets in which we operate. Even things like transportation, telecommunications used to be all governments. Now you're even seeing in Africa, investors investing in in health clinics and schools. So the private sector is now, through technology and innovation, able to invest in things profitably that weren't possible before.
Do you see the private sector more comfortable sitting side by side a DFI or coming in subsequent to a DFI?
So I think either one. I mean, certainly with OPIC, of course, we're providing loans alongside private capital investments. And when we see that banks begin to enter a market like the solar market in India, we will then pull out and focus on the real frontier markets where banks won't go. But what has been interesting is we've seen this private sector coming into the market throughout the world. We've seen that development finance institutions such as OPIC, growing really fast. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, altogether, the development finance institutions were only doing about $10 billion a year. Mm-hmm. And now it's more like 70 or 80 billion, when, ODA has been completely flat. Just last week, during the World Bank annual meetings, several of the think tanks hosted events for the heads of the DFIs that were in town. And some of the advertisements were things like, 50 billion in one room. So I think there's a belief that this model of catalyzing private sector, but doing so in a sustainable manner that doesn't draw on taxpayer dollars, but actually returns money to the taxpayer, is going to be an increasingly powerful way to catalyze private sector investment.
Terrific. Thanks. Let's dig into product innovation a little bit.
Yep.
You mentioned we're at an inflection point. You also mentioned there are gaps. One of the gaps people have been focusing on are do we have the right products that we're bringing to market? And you, as the head of OPIC, you've been innovating a fair bit on the product side since you arrived, and increasingly over the past couple of years. So maybe share with us a few examples where a new product has galvanized more capital coming in to address a particular challenge, and where it hasn't particularly worked.
Right. Thanks, Lori, for that question. I think I can think of a lot of failures, and maybe I'll just mention two of them. Actually, one famously, we really were working on a liquidity facility. So could we commit to buying, say even 10% of a fund? And we sort of all looked at each other around the table in my office and said, and my CFO sort of said, I think it's kind of like being the fire escape on a burning building. So maybe we went too far on that one, and we couldn't figure out a way to do a liquidity facility. Another one that didn't work so well is we tried to create what we called the aligned capital marketplace, where we thought if we had all these family offices and private investors that were saying to us, wow, we want to get into the market, but it's too expensive, we don't have the origination capabilities, we don't have the network, how about we invest just alongside OPIC? We create a sidecar, and for the debt deals that you're doing, because we don't have equity capabilities, we'll put our equity in, and we'll just piggyback on your origination, your legal, your due diligence, and all of that, and your monitoring, your reporting. So we thought that would work, given the appetite we saw from many family offices and private equity funds. We built a kind of a marketplace where folks could post what they were looking to invest in, and folks could post the capital that was needed. And it really just didn't take off, because it turned out you need more bespoke treatment like that. Two that have worked, and are working now, is we're a project finance shop basically, but we realized that we didn't have the right products for some of the consumer goods companies that are working at the bottom of the pyramid with things like Vision Spring or D-Light, who really needed inventory finance, working capital, not project finance. And so we've adapted our capabilities to be able to do that. And then we also realized, frankly, that Monitor and Acumen and many others have spoken so articulately about the pioneer gap and the need for earlier stage, riskier capital. So we took some of our own capital, kind of put it aside, and said, in a portfolio basis, these smaller stage, earlier, more riskier loans will actually do fine over the long run. So we've created this thing called the Portfolios for Impact, which is able to provide much earlier stage, riskier, smaller scale capital for projects that wouldn't normally meet our underwriting criteria.
Yeah, for those of you who are not familiar with that program, I would encourage you to take a look at it, because I think it's, from where we sit as a practitioner, as an impact investment advisory intermediary, it's one of the few examples of a DFI really pushing the envelope, both on the product side, but really on the risk curve.
Right.
And taking a position and making an allocation, a programmatic pursuit, not a one-off. And I think you've actually encouraged other DFIs by doing that to look at early stage this gap, because it is a fundamental gap that we're experiencing in all markets around the globe. So,
but I want to ask you something on that,
yes,
Lori, because you're now on the board of CDC, so maybe CDC is one of the ones, another DFI in the UK that is doing that. But more specifically, you're asking me about products. What are the products in the marketplace now that you think have the most promise and we should put our weight behind, and which ones do you think maybe are overblown?
So I would say picking up on the blended finance experience that you had, I would agree that it's heavy lifting. These are what we like to call handcrafted at scale transactions. They require a lot of direct touch, customization, negotiation, putting the pieces together. A technology platform isn't the answer for that. They can help, but it's not the answer. But I would say, although we've been disappointed with the pace of blended finance transactions coming to market, we absolutely believe that they are types of transaction vehicles we do need to prioritize, particularly in the context of the first question I asked you in the SDGs. So we're a believer. We have some good examples. You mentioned BRAC. We put together a BRAC facility with 13 different investors sitting in very different chairs with different types of capitals around a table. And that facility that started for Africa has now gone global to support all of BRAC's non-Bangladesh activities. So I think it's possible, but it's heavy lifting. Other areas where we think there's real promise, would be in looking at more permanent investment vehicles, holding company structures and the like, because oftentimes what we're solving for, particularly the early stage examples, the 10-year limited life fund, it just has natural constraints that are not always in the best interest of the investee or the investor when that time horizon arrives. Now, if you set up a permanent investment vehicle, you still have to solve for liquidity somewhere in the picture, so you can't just kick the can down the road. But we do think there's some real innovation happening in holding company structures and open-ended investment vehicles that are exciting. And lastly, I would say the retail product. I mean, my personal view is until we get retail investors engaged in impact investing, we are not going to move the needle, and certainly not with institutional investors. So we have some leaders out there, but what I think any movement requires is mass participation, is the retail market to participate. So there's some work being done to introduce some retail products, and I'm hopeful in that regard. In terms of what's been maybe overemphasized, I have a concern about, particularly the past 2 years, the social impact bond, development impact bond movement. I think it's an important instrument, not to misunderstand my comment, but I worry a little bit that it's been highlighted as a singular solution to lots of challenges and development issues. And I think it just needs to be calibrated within the entire toolkit of product solutions and innovations would be my comment on that.
Yeah, I'd love to talk more about the retail product, because clearly we see all the banks that are coming to OPIC now for advice as to how do they get into this market. You know, I see them struggling about how do they take their capabilities and meet the demands of retail that wants something much smaller scale, more bespoke,
Exactly.
more grassrootsy.
Exactly, exactly. And there are markets where it's happening. I'd like to encourage people to come down and ask questions of Elizabeth, or to share a comment and a thought as we kick off the day together. I mean, one point, while people are coming down, hopefully one point about the retail market, I think what's interesting is looking at the solidarity funds in France. So there's been a lot of really interesting work, and now it's the default mutual fund product in France to have an impact component to retail products. And I think that's really exciting.
And in the Netherlands
folks.
too.
And in the Netherlands as well. Right. That's exactly right. Yeah. And I don't think it requires a legislative change in this country. I do think it's some innovation on the product side and thinking about it. Good, we have somebody to ask the first question of the day.
When I give a talk, I always like somebody to give the first question. So I'm Paula DePerna from CDP. I think we've met before. Notwithstanding all the success and marvelous evolution you described in your remarks, what about the demise of belief in public budgets? You know, there's a kind of feeling now that private capital has to step in and you know, I'd love to hear, you know, for example, DARPA research. You know, DARPA research is public money, tax money, and it underpins a lot of private product development, which then becomes commercialized and has social impact and so on. So, like, how can we sort of retain the belief in public budget while also promoting the importance of private capital in all of this, which obviously is inescapable? And thanks for your leadership.
It's a great question. We'll take a couple. Are there any other questions out of the gate, Vivina? Can always count on you. A question to kick us off. We'll take a couple, and if anybody on this side of the room, we don't want to have only the right side here. We need the left side.
So,
Vina, please.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Laurie. It's always a pleasure to be in a room with both of you. The energy and the passion for what you're doing is wonderful. My name is Vivina Berla. I work with Sarona Asset Management. And I suppose the thought, the comment, and the question is, a gentleman from the Canadian government has actually written a paper that was originally titled with a very punchy line from DFI to BFI, so from development financial institution to blended financial institution. After a number of iterations, the title was watered down, and it sort of only became a one-liner on the 5th paragraph of the paper. And it was your first question, Laurie, you know, what is the role of the DFIs? We are very grateful for the support of OPIC and actually being the innovative leader in blended finance. The Canadian government accompanied OPIC in that adventure. And yet, I cannot stop feeling that DFIs are not yet in a position to embrace blended finance to the extent that some have done. And I didn't know, Laurie, that you're now on the board of CDC. Congratulations. So you're now in a wonderful position to answer the question of what is the future of the DFIs, in particular as it pertains to blended finance. Thank you.
I think it might be great, Vivina, if you shared with folks what your definition of blended finance is, because I think there are many.
So the way we define, and we, I mean Sarona, define blended finance is when you have government money and private money, and indeed any other type of money that is willing to invest in a product, in an investable product, but with different expectations of risk and return. So that once you blend the different investors who have different expectations into a single product, you're actually able to attract a greater amount of capital for the purpose of having the impact that you're seeking. And that's how we define it.
In that scenario, Vivina, do you think the expectations on impact are the same or different of those players?
I think that the
expectation of impact.
The definitions of impact must be aligned, otherwise blended finance will not work.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Great question. We'll take two more and then we'll respond. Let's be balanced. Other side.
Hi, I'm Will Poole with Capria, and among other things, we help fund managers in emerging markets raise capital from DFIs. And I'm curious as to your hopes around Congress unshackling you to be able to invest in equity as opposed to debt forms, which would make your investments more compatible with other DFIs, because right now it's sort of hard to mix the two. And if you could just give us some hope on that question, I'd appreciate it.
Great. And then back over here.
Sure. Thank you. Kim Paris from Bank of America Merrill Lynch. And you talked about, retail really being an opportunity in kind of this mass distribution or acceptance. One of the things that we talk a lot about and struggle with is how do we get past, what are the barriers? And we certainly look at it from the standpoint awareness and generating that awareness, but then also the measurement. But do you, so I'm interested in what do you see as potential barriers to kind of this mass adoption? And do you think there's a tie-in to kind of this need for that longer-term view, and that retail investors are still, very focused in the way we do kind of their wealth management and planning is still a short-term focus relative to the length of what we're talking about with impact investing?
Great question, thank you. And last one, and then we'll take another round after.
Hello, Laurie and Elizabeth. Joan Trant from TriLink Global. TriLink Global is a fund manager that creates and manages funds that attract capital from all comers, including retail. And my question for both of you is, what is going on the policy front, maybe even things that you're working on kind of behind the scenes that you can talk about creating more collaboration and enabling opportunities for the full spectrum of impact investments in the developing economies? Thank you.
Great, thanks, Joan. Perfect. So why don't we bundle these a little bit, yeah? Yeah? So why don't you kick off?
Sure, thank you for all those thoughtful comments. With respect to the blended finance question, I'm struggling with this a little bit myself in terms of definition, because on the one hand, I absolutely think we need far more players to bring their capital together in vehicles where one has different expectations than the next. So some grant money, some development finance institution money that's de-risking perhaps private capital in the same structure. So, but I worry about the word blending. So for me, it's more aligning. Aligning in some cases these different types of providers of capital with different motivations, different incentives, different mandates, aligned up at the same time at the same place. Whereas blending suggests to me that we're subsidizing interest rates, and that actually creates market distortions that I worry about. So I'm not yet fully clear on this. It was interesting. I was at a meeting over the bank fund annual meetings. It was convened for the heads of the DFIs to discuss this, when to blend and when not to blend. When is it essential and when is it distorting? And so I don't think we've quite figured it out yet. But I think one of the key things in that is, as I mentioned earlier, having grant providers whose mandate is to provide grants understand that if they can provide the grants in ways that creates a huge catalytic inflow of capital that are non-grant money, that's a good thing. Whereas I hear too many foundations continually saying, well, I don't want my grant money to be something that he's going to make profits off of. And that's, I think, an old-fashioned way of thinking. So anyway, blending or aligning capital, I'm not really sure. I just want to say one more thing on this. We were so frustrated at OPIC at the number of projects that were coming our way. We get about 2,000 inquiries in a year, and we do about 100 transactions. So a lot of those transactions we were saying no to because the business plan didn't hang together, the capital structure was insufficient for us to lend on top of it. That gets to your equity point. It didn't meet our policy requirements. But there's a number of them that if AID or another grant provider had come in and provided a little slug of money that could have been invested as capital, then we could have done the deal. And that could have been $5 million coming in to catalyze maybe $100 million. So we did what we oughtn't have done, and I wish we didn't have to do, which is get money from the State Department to create a grant facility that we managed. And even though it's been highly successful in the off-grid space, has created 30 small-scale off-grid energy projects in Africa that never would have happened before, some of which are graduating onto commercial finance. I feel like we should have the commercial tools and not grant tools, and make it a cleaner division between an OPIC with debt and equity and insurance and a grant maker like AID with its grant capabilities. We're not very good at doing grants. So yeah, that's a long way of answering your question. I want to just take the equity question.
Can I add on that one?
Yeah, maybe, why don't you say, yes, why don't we go back and forth on this?
Yeah, so let's do them thematically. So on that one, because you asked me my perspective now sitting on the CDC board, and you have a different viewpoint, I will say, being around the board table. And the good news is I think CDC as a DFI has expanded its activity toolkit. So it used to be known as an investor into funds and a debt shop. Increasingly, they have a direct investment portfolio, and I think that's terrific. And I think it has also sensitized the organization to the need for aligned and blended deal structures. So I'm quite confident that that activity set in the existing portfolio, plus the desire to expand that portfolio, will actually propel CDC to do more of these types of transactions. I agree with Elizabeth's comments that there's a distinction between alignment and blending the actual capital. I think we do need both, and it's the clarity of what role that capital is providing in a transaction. And the only other thing I would say, Vivine, is for me, it's not just about the difference of expectations. Sometimes it's actually the constraints. An actor has real constraints. Regulatory, charter, investor constraints. And what I think in my maturation process, what I'm realizing is you have to meet people where they are. And if there is that commonality of the impact objective, which I agree with you completely, that's what grounds the transaction, then I think also it's understanding how do I work within someone's existing constraints to bring that capital in. And the very final thing I would say is we've seen some really interesting deal structures where the private capital may be cautious, and so you are tapping that grant catalytic risk mitigation capital to get them to play. But because you're doing that, you're also suggesting that the proceeds of the transaction, if they exceed certain expectations, will also be utilized to replenish some of that existing grant pool. Because the grant capital is a very scarce commodity, and we have to use it judiciously, but we also have to think about ways to replenish it. So I think there are some clever ways to address a concern out of the gate, but also be smart on the way out of replenishing.
So yeah, I agree with that point, and we could go off on this. We're seeing the blending of concessional finance with commercial finance, running the risk of reversing some of the grounds that have been made, for example, in financing renewable energy in Africa, because tariffs are coming down so low that it can't be financed commercially anymore, because some players are actually using the grant money to enable them to subsidize interest rates such that all the DFIs that were able to play can't afford it anymore at these levels. So as I've said to some of my colleagues, we're trying to go from billions to trillions, but when you start adding scarce grant money in, pushing prices down and getting people hooked on blended finance, you're going to go from billions to millions pretty fast. Anyway, it's a pet peeve. On the equity front, I appreciate your question, and I know, and I apologize on behalf of the U.S. government, that it has been so difficult as GPs to have OPIC in your debt structures because we don't have the authority to do equity. As I mentioned earlier, it's kind of ironic, but the development architecture of the U.S. government was designed in the Nixon era and hasn't really materially changed since, even though the world has changed. So the real question I continue to ask my colleagues in the administration, on the Hill, around town, the think tanks, are we really organized for the 21st century challenges to meet the SDGs? Do we have the right tools and the right resources and the right skills and the right instrument in the right institutions, within the development architecture of this country? And I think we don't. And I think the rest of the DFI market certainly struggles because it drives them crazy that we can't invest in a vehicle pari passu with them. We're always senior because our instrument is not equity. There's a holdover notion that the U.S. government shouldn't own shares in foreign companies. We've been pushing back and saying, okay, we don't want the authority to invest capital in a project, equity in project, but we do want the ability to have LP authority to invest pari passu with other DFIs. And in the last couple of years, we've made significant strides on that. I think the next guy will have a chance to see that finally coming to fruition. But we have designed our product, as you probably know, and it has been successful. We've just done 3 new funds with a new product that is as equity-like as conceivably possible without legally tripping over into being actual equity.
In your dream list of top policy priorities, would this be one to change?
Yes. Yes, it would.
Clear answer. I like that. Yes. Whoever will have that in the notes for
So there were a couple of other questions that I feel we haven't given.
Public budgets and public money, and then retail.
Right. So maybe I'll just say a word about it,
Please.
and then you can go on. As far as public budgets are concerned, I feel it's finally dawning on policymakers that I talk to on the Hill, and frankly, OPIC has quite a lot of support now. It didn't before, but now on both the left and the right. I mean, the wings of both parties are more challenging, but in the mainstream, we have a lot of support because people are really excited about the notion that you can do development, support business, advance, U.S. foreign policy goals and development goals, and make money for the taxpayer that cross-subsidizes aid. I mean, that seems like a pretty good thing you should try to do more of. So the argument we've been making is this is a business model that works, that's profitable, that does development in a highly modern way. It should grow to meet market demand until its capacity is beginning to be absorbed. So that's what we've spent the last 7 years since I've been there, really, really strengthening the architecture of the agency and building risk management systems and MIS systems and modernizing processes and policies and automating stuff and building a whole architecture that is now a fully fledged, grown-up, modern financial institution that is ready to scale when the Congress sees fit to allow us to spend some of the money that we generate every year.
And the only thing I would add on giving the perspective of another country, American, but I happen to live overseas, and I've been living in the United Kingdom during this whole Brexit transition development. And what's been interesting, despite all of the negativity around the underpinnings of the Brexit vote, what's been interesting is the government's recommitment to the overall development budget of the United Kingdom, almost as a response to a kind of a counterpunch to the Brexit vote. And that's been very welcomed by UK professionals, citizens, and institutions, including CDC, but it's not limited to CDC, but it's the government standing up. Theresa May said it when she was here in New York a few weeks ago at the UN meeting, said we're not going to dilute that commitment. And I think that's a very good sign. Yeah. Anything else on the policy front before we talk about retail briefly? And anybody else with questions, please come down. We do have a few more minutes.
Well, on the retail question, frankly, I'd love to throw it back to all of you because you struggle daily with being larger institutions that are trying to meet retail demand, which we all know it's there. But we just haven't found a way to help it express itself in the tools that we offer. So I'd love to hear from anyone that's got thoughts on that. But just intuitively, I feel like retail is much more ready to be long-term in its thinking than maybe the financial advisors are or the financial markets are. Because I think intuitively people get it. We get that it takes a long time to realize, economic value. I've been very excited to see, that's not true. I'm not excited. I'm deeply worried about the fact that we don't have ways to incentivize longer term thinking, whether it's in political cycles or financial accounting cycles. It's all geared towards quick turn. And I know, Lori, as you've often said, if the financial crisis didn't teach us anything, it should have been the value of long-term, sustainable, realistic returns rather than the quick fix. So, there are some reasons to be hopeful, like Unilever switching to annual reporting away from quarterly. Okay, that's still pretty short, but still, it's a step in the right direction. Nestle having a shareholder resolution that states that its mission is the generation of long-term shareholder value, sustainable shareholder value. That's progress. Warren Buffett's done pretty well, and he's a very long-term thinker. So, I'm worried because I don't think we'll get there in time, but at least I see some beginnings of thoughtful work on this long-term versus short-term front. And I think, frankly, retail is more likely to get it more quickly than our institutions do.
And just from my experience, I would agree with that completely. I think the retail individual investor, sure, everybody looks at their accounts and what's happening, but I agree with Elizabeth. I think there is at least an appetite for considering an investment over a longer arc. I do think that they're looking to their financial advisors often for the advice, for the guidance, for the support. And one of the challenges that we've experienced is that oftentimes the dynamic in the marketplace, perhaps not in the people in this room, but people outside this room, a financial advisor will say, we'll only start having this conversation or looking at these types of deals that we're largely referring to when people ask for it.
Yeah.
And I would actually think the dynamic has to flip. I think a responsible financial advisor should be proactively tapping the awareness, the education, not forcing product on people, of course not, but I don't think it's waiting until the asset owner, the individual comes and says, can you show me something or can you talk to me about this thing called sustainable, responsible impact investing? I really do think if we're convicted about it and the demonstration now is there, it should be the other way around. And more financial advisors should be proactive. So that's something I would just make an appeal, again, not for the people in this room, but for the people who are not in this room who are engaged in that business.
While we're waiting, we're doing one last one.
Yeah, one more. If anybody else has a question? Yeah, we do.
So while we're waiting, if I can just add one tiny thing, sorry, I get passionate about these topics, but when you think about it, there's nothing much more long-term than OPIC. We're able to make, 15, 20-year loans in some cases, and frankly, that is really at the core of our development impact.
Yeah. And
I have often said, and I think financial people get it, is when you look at the fact that our non-performing loans are around 5.89% generally, but our write-offs are less than 1% net of recoveries, to me the gap between those two numbers, which is way bigger than you'd see at a financial institution who would write off those NPLs much quicker, that gap is the development impact that we're having.
Right.
Because our clients stumble a lot, 6% of them stumble, but they don't fall because we're patient and we enable them to work out the problems and we work with them over time such that in the end, we don't have to write off their loans because we all know that the quickest way to undermine your development impact is to undermine your financial impact. Exactly. So things that don't succeed financially won't succeed developmentally, but that's long-term thinking at work. Yep. And anyway.
Yeah, fantastic. One last question here.
Thank you. Jackie Vanderbrug, Bank of America Merrill Lynch. So maybe transitioning from this comment about retail and the fact that we really could encourage, or retail investors are maybe ahead of advisors, and we and others have seen that women retail investors are ahead of their advisors even more. research 40% more than men, et cetera.
And
I will
younger
say,
ones, too.
if you look around this room, there's a lot more men than were at the first Highwater Women Conference. So kudos. I feel like we're really, it's a big shift. But I would be curious from both of you how you see the gender dynamics playing, both in terms of who's leading in the conversations around impact investing. I've had conversations with people who say, oh my gosh, this field is going to be feminized and that will lead to its marginalization, which makes me quite angry because I feel like the fact that there's 50% women in the room doesn't, there's a whole conversation there. But then also, gender is woven through the SDGs. And Lori, you've been a real leader on that front of saying gender makes a smarter investor. So how do you see, given that we're at the Highwater Women Conference, gender playing both in the investor side and in the investment analysis side?
Right. Yeah, terrific question, Jackie. Thank you. Do you want to kick off?
I kind of wish this wasn't being recorded. Because what I was going to say, and since I'm in the fourth quarter of my second term, I'll say it, but
off the record.
No, it's so interesting. What we used to say that in the early days of microfinance, it was only women in the room, and then when it started getting credible and taking off, suddenly it was all men. So I don't mean to say that the wonderful men in this room are kind of Johnny-come-latelys, but I do think women in sector after sector, when it comes to values and social purpose, are always the pioneers. And I just think that's been an interesting observation. Maybe we're going to see the same thing here. Anyway, I'd say that.
Yeah, I would actually agree with that statement. And then I think, Jackie, what I've seen is on the investor side, I do think that there's a gender gap, may be too strong, but certainly a gender distinction between the institutional investor leadership and foundation, family office, DFI leadership. And I don't think that has to do necessarily with the investment thesis. I think it has a lot to do with who's at the helm of those institutions. And through all of your good work and research, there's still a big gender disparity as to who's in the leadership role, who's around the board. I mean, I've just joined a board. There are 2 women on this board. It is not which I think is terrific, but in terms of just numerics, there's a gap and a differential there. So that still plays out a bit on the individual investor side. I think you're right, some of the more pioneering, both individuals who want to put their capital to work, whether it's through the next panel is going to talk about the intergenerational changes, what's happening there. I think we're seeing women play a very powerful, very strong, very dynamic, very credible role, and they are the asset owners in those conversations. And I think that's exciting and critically important. I just see a gap between the institutional investors and the leadership there and other opportunities for women. Yeah. Is that responsive? Yeah. Okay. Good. So in the last couple of minutes, Elizabeth and I, we did meet last week. We know each other for many, many years, as she referred to. And we said, okay, in our closing, rather than a formal closing remark, we might just share a couple of thoughts. If we were having this conversation 10 years from today, so we're back in this room or maybe another room 10 years from today, what are some of the thoughts that come to our mind that might actually be fuel for the rest of our day here today? And just kind of a couple of things in our imagination 10 years from today.
So my first one, of course, is that I definitely believe that within 10 years, in fact, even within 2 or 3 years, that development finance taken together will have surpassed aid globally.
Yeah. And I would have thought 10 years from today, the leading global impact investment bank is headquartered in Lagos, and the woman CEO is on this stage addressing us all.
Nice. And I have long hoped and thought, and I think it may well come true, that stock markets throughout the world, including Lagos, will be tracking not only earnings per share, but impact per share.
And I would believe that every 401k plan has an impact offering.
And I would say my last one would be that every product that you buy, irrespective of where you buy it, will have a label on it that clearly says the greenhouse gas emissions and other natural resources that were consumed in producing that product.
And I would say that the default analytical framework for every investment decision of every CIO, whether it's an individual or an institution, has 3 dimensions: risk, return, and impact.
Amen.
Good. Great. So thank you all, and please thank Elizabeth.
Thank all of you.